I'd like to start today just by acknowledging that we're touring today the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Marran Baba grasslands, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations people who are watching today. I'd also like to just say thank you to the Wurundjeri people for caring for this land for many thousands of years and for continuing to care for the land and having strong cultural connections to the land. We're lucky at Merri Creek to be able to work with Wurundjeri and learn from them, especially in the grasslands and with burning. Yeah, that's very lucky to be able to learn that knowledge and share our knowledge too. So my name is Sarah and I work with the Merri Creek Management Committee. As I said, I'll be moderating today. And we've got 4 staff members out in the Marran Baba grasslands. So we've got, I'll just switch over to a map. Here we go. So we've got Galgi Ngarrk up in the north between the Hume Highway and the Hume Freeway. And we've got Michael and Sophie out there at Galgi Ngarrk grassland. And then further south in Bababi Marning grassland, we have Dom and Charlotte who will be showing us around there. So these areas have the Woiwurrung names, which is the Woiwurrung is the language of the Wurundjeri people. So collectively, they're known as the Marran Baba grasslands, which translates to body of mother. Bababi Marning translates to mother's hand, and Galgi Ngarrk translates to the backbone. So it's very special to have those names for use. So I'd just like to also say thank you to today's funded through the Commonwealth Communities Environment Program. We have 2 grants through there. One of the grants is through the Friends of Merri Creek and one's through Merri Creek Management Committee. So thank you to the grant for letting us do this today. So I'll stop my screen share and I will hand over to Michael and Sophie out at Galgi Ngarrk.
Hi, yeah, thanks everybody for coming along. And it is a little bit windy out here, so apologies if yeah, work around that, but let us know if you can't hear anything that we're saying. Yep, so I'm Michael from Merri Creek Management Committee, and Sophie's holding the camera at the moment, but she'll be on camera soon as well. Quick note in case anyone's concerned about us not wearing face masks. Normally we wear face masks whenever we're out in the field, but today we're operating under an exemption that allows live streaming people to take their masks off temporarily so we can properly enunciate. But some of us have issues enunciating even at the best of times, so bear with us there as well. But rest assured also that we'll be masking up again as soon as we're off. So yeah, we're out here at Galgi Ngarrk today, which is the Craigieburn Grassland Nature Conservation Area. It's approximately a 300 to 400 hectare reserve. I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head. In stretching between parts of Epping and Wollert. Just briefly about Merri Creek Management Committee, in case you don't know what this organisation is. We're a not-for-profit group that was set up by the Friends of Merri Creek, together with all the local governments within the Merri Creek catchment. We've been around since 1989, and our mission is to try and protect the natural aspects of the Merri Creek, the biodiversity and the amenity of the area, and both the creek corridor and its surrounding environs. Yeah, so today we're going to be looking at 2 different grassland reserves. These grasslands are critically endangered ecosystems. They are occurring on volcanic country, so if you aren't aware of the recent geological history of this area, the north of Melbourne and much of Western Victoria has had a sustained period of volcanic activity for about the last 2 million years. If you've been up the Hume in the northern suburbs, you might have seen some of the hills around Craigieburn and Calcallo and Wallen. These hills are volcanic cones from eruptions that occurred about 2 million years ago, which spread lava across the landscape and filled in the old Merri Creek, flowing down those creek valleys all the way to Fairfield. And on top of those, so that as that lava cooled down, it formed a rock called basalt. And if you've been along the Merry Creek, you'll have seen all those boulders. I mean, you can see some here right next to us now. These are basalt boulders, and the Merry Creek gets its name from these rocks. Merry Merry, meaning very rocky in Woiwurrung. On these basalt landscapes, as soil slowly formed from the boulders breaking down, we got these really heavy clay soils forming. And those soils tended to favour particular types of plants with really fibrous root systems, so specifically the grassy species. And trees can still grow on those plains, and they do, but their woody roots aren't really favoured, so the grasses have an advantage. So right across this volcanic plain in Western Victoria, these grassland communities started to form following volcanic activity. And we'll look more closely at some of their characteristics today. But while we're here on the creek, before we venture into the grassland itself, we're just going to have a look at a few of the key things here. We can't hear any of them today, but we're actually in a hotspot for growling grass frogs, which are a threatened species of frog. The Merry Creek is one of their strongholds in Victoria. They are threatened by habitat fragmentation, changes to hydrology, pollution, and particularly these days by a fungal pathogen called chytrid fungus. So chytridiomycosis is a disease suffered by many amphibians throughout the world, and growling grass frogs are suspected to have been heavily affected by that as well. But in the Merry Creek, because again of these basalt geology, we actually have slightly saline conditions that are thought to inhibit the spread of chytrid fungus to a degree, and so some of these slightly saline waters actually provide havens for growling grass frogs as well. So yeah, it's possible that we'll hear them calling later on in the day, and if you happen to come wandering out here in the next few months, yeah, on a sunny day, you'll probably hear them calling as well, possibly calling as well. I won't get your hopes up too much, but it's worth a trip out here. So yeah, I might hand it over to Sophie and we'll have a look at some of the plants growing here along this Merry Creek escarpment.
Hey everyone, I'm Sophie, one of Merry Creek Management Committee's Ecological Restoration team members. And we're going to check out some plants on the escarpment at the moment. So here we have what's called clustered everlasting, Chrysocephalum semiproposum. And this is, yeah, a really beautiful native daisy. It's got these very small golden yellow flowers that are clustered at the tip. And this really beautiful fine green, slightly blue-grey foliage, which depending on what stage of its life cycle it's in, can vary quite considerably. The yellow flowers provide a really great food source for butterflies and other insects. And this little patch of clustered everlasting is really special to us at Merry Creek, and also within the Merry Creek catchment, as it is the only remnant population that's actually left in the Merry Creek catchment of the local form. So it's, yeah, something that we're really keen to protect and preserve. Limited remnant populations like this are really vital to our restoration and revegetation projects, as they provide a source material of local provenance that we can use. So yeah, that's one of the really cool, beautiful plants that is here. That is, yeah, not something that's listed under federal or state environmental laws, but within the catchment is incredibly rare and depleted, but thankfully is still here. And if we have a look down the escarpment, which is very steep, you might be able to see rock coria, which is sticking out of the rocks there. If you can see some shiny green rounded foliage. So again, rock coria, much like the clustered everlasting, would have been quite a widespread species before colonisation, but there's only a handful of remnant populations left within the catchment. I don't think you might not be able to see from there, but it does have these really beautiful bell-shaped pale yellow-green flowers that do flower during the cooler months. So it provides a really good, reliable nectar source for birds over winter. And it's something that, yeah, you might see planted further south of the creek in lots of revegetation areas. Mary Creek's had a pretty interesting project to try and increase the genetic diversity within local populations and their success breeding in the wild, which I don't know if Michael would like to talk about at all or a little bit later.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly.
Oh, it's sorry. A few technical difficulties, guys. There we go.
So yeah, rock coria, it's a pretty common plant in revegetation, but the main way it's grown by nurseries is by cuttings. And so I realised a few years ago that we're never seeing any seeds actually form on these plants. And we looked into it, we realised that by the thousand along the Merry were all coming from cuttings, that were coming from cuttings, that were all coming from cuttings of possibly only one or two, very small number of plants. So there were severe issues in I guess genetic diversity in that species. But the plants that Sophie was just talking about here at Galgi Ngarrk, along these steep escarpments, we do still have scattered remnant plants of rock coria. So we've had a project a few years ago trying to bring all those scattered plants together in some areas where nurseries can come in and they're getting a range of genetic individuals, so a diverse collection of plants, so then hopefully future revegetation efforts can be a bit less inbred and yeah, actually get those plants flowering and producing seed again. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about here, Sophie, or we might hand it over to Dom and Charlotte at Bababi Marning.
Hey everybody, hope you can hear me. I'm Dom. We're out here in the Bababi Marning grassland, as Sarah said. Yeah. I'm pretty conscious of the wind. It's very loud out here, so if you can't hear anything, just type in the chat, and then Sarah can tell Charlotte, and Charlotte can bring the camera close to me. So we're trying to stay low so I can be heard. Thanks to Michael and Soph, that was great, and it's really interesting seeing a lot of those herbs, especially in Galgi Ngarrk. The Chrysocephalum semiproposum, as Soph said, is really special. It's something that we're trying to keep safe, just like a bunch of herbs out here. So we're here in Bababi Marning. It's really not too far from the city. It's quite a large site at around 40 hectares. It's bordered just down the hill by the Merry Creek on the east, and over to the west. Hopefully, if we can just show here, we've got a number of factories and a road along the west, and then also to the northeast over the other side of the creek, we're bordered by a lot of factories as well. So, as Michael said, the grasslands throughout the Victorian volcanic plain are of volcanic origin, and we tend to find a lot of native grasses dominating the understory. So the main grass that I'm holding here is Kangaroo Grass, or Femina triandra. Hopefully you can see that. It's a C4 grass, which is a summer growing grass, and it's really dominant, especially in the root, the rhizosphere or under the ground. So it really outcompetes a lot of the other grasses, and especially in more drier areas. All right, so yeah, as I was saying, kangaroo grass is the main grass that we see here along Marran Baba and along a lot of the other grasslands throughout the Victorian volcanic plain. We also have a number of other grasses, including speargrasses, wallaby grasses, and those are more cooler season ones that don't tend to be so dominant. In between a lot of the grasses, we have a large amount of what's called intertussic space. So intertussic space is basically the bare ground in between the grasses where a lot of herbaceous plants, so lilies, daisies, a lot of little bindweeds, and even crickets are found. So grasslands, especially in regards to kangaroo grass, will grow throughout the spring and summer. And then at the end of summer, a lot of that old dead growth will start to die, but it'll actually remain on the plant. So at the end of summer, we often see fire coming through, and that's a process of renewal by burning away that old foliage, by increasing the amount of space, like water and sun, that can get to the actual soil surface. That's where we see a lot of those herbs come up. So grasslands are pretty unique, and they're really under threat at the moment. They've been under threat through clearing and grazing for hundreds of years since colonization. And the biggest threat that we face, especially in Marran Baba here, are weeds. It's estimated that around in the grasslands of the Victorian volcanic plain, we have around 25% weed cover, which is very enormous. And a lot of those weeds, especially the grassy ones that we're about to see today, are really, really intracted, and they're very difficult to remove. So one of the main weeds that we have here is a South American grass called serrated tussock, or Nacella trichotoma. And there's also, I'll just try and find it, another species of Nacella, just here, called Chilean needlegrass, or Nacella niceana. So although they're very, very closely related, they're in the same genus, they do look a little bit different. And these grasses were brought over presumably through wool bales or through just like general agricultural products from South America. And when they got here, they spread very rapidly. And now we pretty much find them in almost every grassland throughout the north, especially along the Murray. And here at Murray Creek, we spend a lot of time trying to remove them. So they're cool season grasses, and they have a dormancy period. So when they spread their seed, they're dormant for a year, but they also spread very rapidly with thousands of seed per plant. So it might be difficult to see, but we do have the Nacella species are pretty much found throughout the grassland, and they grow very, very thick, and they're highly competitive. So they'll outgrow the kangaroo grasses, outgrow the spear grasses, and remove a lot of the space for the lilies and the orchids and the daisies to grow. So just like the chrysophyllum that Soph and Michael showed you, we're going to show you some a few little herbs that still manage to persist in the grassland despite that weed invasion. So just over here, and hopefully we can see it if we come down low,
yep,
is Goodenia pinnatifida. It's also known as cutleaf goodenia. It's a bit hard to see the foliage down the bottom, but it's a really beautiful little yellow wildflower, and we often see it come up in these large patches throughout the grasslands. So you wouldn't find this in a lot of the other grasslands closer down in city of Moreland or city of Darebin. We tend to find it out here in bigger, sort of larger patches. We also have, and thankfully it's very sunny, so it's coming out today. We have Convolvulous Angustismus, or the pink bindweed. It's in Convolvulaceae, so it's in the same family as sweet potato. And it gets a beautiful little pink flower there. And usually it's very large, and you often don't see the foliage, but it's often twining, covered in throughout the other tussocks and whatnot. So this spot here where we are is one of the more lower quality spots in Marran Baba. It's really quite a varied landscape. So with the weed invasion from the south, they've gradually moved north, and they're starting to displace a lot of that kangaroo grass sward. But we've actually done a lot of work here over time to remove both the Chilean needlegrass and the serrated tussock, and a lot of the gorse as well that we see here. So gorse is a really, really spiky, noxious shrub, which it's difficult to see here, but it gets covered in these beautiful yellow bee flowers. It's really spiky, so it doesn't really tend to get preyed on or eaten by kangaroos or by any cattle or anything, but it really spreads very far, and the seeds sit into the soil for up to 80 years. So there's a saying which is a year of seeding, a decade of weeding, and it's very true. So we do try and remove this where we can, because that seed bank will remain there for a very long time, and it creates these very, very big thickets that can be really difficult to remove. So the Friends of Ngarrk Creek have been doing a lot of work here for about, I believe, 20 years, removing a lot of the gorse. They've been removing a lot of it down there on the creek, and we use chemical control to try and maintain all those gains that they made, just as Michael said, and that's basically what we do here at MCMC. So we've done a lot of work. When we do actually remove these plants, when we do remove the gorse, we also need to reintroduce the structure back for especially a lot of those birds, a lot of the invertebrates, a lot of the insects that might be actually using them. And we've done a lot of planting up there with a lot of like smaller shrubs, a lot of tree violet, a lot of bursaria, these plants that you tend to see a little bit further down the creek in a lot of those re-veg areas as well. So
we can pass that on if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
You put that through on the chat.
Yeah.
And then we might hand it over back to Michael. If you're happy with that, Sarah.
Yep. I'm just writing some of the species names up in the chat, so you guys can Google those ones if you want to have a look at them. And we'll hand over to Michael and Sophie.
Great. Over and out.
Okay, so yeah, we're here at another part of Galgi now on a Stony Knoll. So Sophie's just going to talk to you a bit about what is a Stony Knoll.
What is a Stony Knoll, I hear you ask? Or maybe you didn't. But so Stony Knolls are low stony rises that you find scattered around the Victorian volcanic plains landscape. They're formed through volcanic activity that Michael spoke about earlier. Out at Galgi, there's quite a few scattered around here in varying condition, but the one that we're on at the moment is in, really lovely condition. There's a range of different, indigenous plants all living here. Stony Knolls are pretty cool within their own right. I guess a really large proportion of the ground is made up of surface rock, which creates all these really interesting microhabitats and microclimates for different plant species to exist. Some of them you might not expect to see in a grassland type environment, like this little dude that we have here, which is actually a common maidenhair fern. So this isn't something that you see particularly often along the Ngarrk Creek. There are some really nice patches of different native ferns living in the knolls and escarpment here at Galgi. And I don't know, it still blows my mind that ferns live in grasslands. So and Stony Knolls as well, like escarpments, the one that Michael and I were on before. I guess they've also acted in a way as a refuge for a lot of Ngarrk Creek's original flora. It's protected it from the pressures from grazing and hard-hooved animals. So we do find that a lot of remnant plants that aren't so common in the catchment are existing or persisting in Stony Knolls and escarpments. While we're down here, we can have a look as well at this really nice speargrass. This is rough speargrass, Osterostypha semibarbata. It's got these really beautiful fluffy seed heads. And Dom was just talking about Chilean needlegrass, Nacella, which is a really huge environmental weed problem in grasslands throughout Victoria. So this is related to it, but it is indigenous. And I guess the difference is that it doesn't tend to it exists in the landscape. Sorry, that's a really bad explanation. But you see Chilean and it forms these really dense swords and will cover all of the surrounding vegetation as well. But here we've got, beautiful plants like this speargrass and fern sort of happily, hanging out together. So I think Michael was also going to talk about some other plants that are here on the knoll. So we're just going to switch over.
So the Stony Knoll that we're standing on is actually jump down here further. It's a really special one in this sort of Melbourne context because it's got a big population of this little grevillea here. So this is a bit of a ambiguous species. Some people call it Latrobe's grevillea, Sometimes it gets called rosemary grevillea, but rosemary grevillea you've probably seen in lots of people's gardens. It's been widely used in landscaping for about 100 years. But the rosemary grevillea that you see in all these planted areas is from northern New South Wales, whereas this little grevillea is known from here at Galgi. It's also known from up at another grassland in Calcallo, and there's a couple of scattered populations along the Plenty River and around Eltham. So it's something that hasn't had a lot of research. No one's probably written it up and described it in any of the botanical sort of literature. But yeah, it's here growing all over this Stony Knoll. So again, it's protected. It's sort of it's a root suckering kind of grevillea, which the standard ones aren't. Yeah, and so it's making the most of this really rough environment. Its roots are spreading out with great protection, getting lots of runoff from the rocks, and it's doing incredibly well through here. So it's something that we're trying to integrate into all our sort of Stony Knoll type plantings to try and get this plant secured at a few other reserves throughout the catchment as well. And yeah, I mean, I guess we're interested in trying to bring it to reunite all the scattered populations on the Plenty Gorge and Calcallo, but that kind of relies on doing a bit of linking in with somebody who can do the botanical research as well. But yeah, this is a really beautiful example of the Stony Knoll. You can see all these lomandras hiding in the cracks as well. I don't think I've ever seen them sort of growing as vigorously in the wild, at least, as they do seem to through here. So yeah, sort of really rocky nature has done an incredible job of protecting these plants from all the surrounding kinds of threats.
Michael, can I jump in with a question from Lucas?
Yep.
Lucas can notice in the background the industrial buildings, and we can see the power lines, etc. He's just wondering what type of protection or land classification that these grasslands have.
Yeah, so the natural temperate grasslands of the Victorian Volcanic Plain, which is the formal title of these communities, sort of at a federal level, they're protected under the federal Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and they're sort of mirrored in state legislation as Western Basalt Plains grasslands, which are protected under the Fauna and Flora Guarantee Act, which is a state legislation. What that means in practice, it doesn't mean that they can't be destroyed if somebody wants to build a factory or something else. You can still destroy them, you just have to pay a certain amount of money so they can be offset somewhere else. So yeah, unfortunately the legislation doesn't sort of really acknowledge quite how threatened these things are, even though they are critically endangered under the various legislation. That doesn't mean they can't be gotten rid of and supposedly sort of reproduced or protected elsewhere. So yeah, unfortunately the legislation offers some sort of protection, but it's not the protection they need, given that in Victoria we're down to about 0.1% of these communities remaining compared to what was here 150 years ago. So yeah, I strongly recommend, I mean, areas like Craigieburn grassland have only been protected from development because of community action to lobby government to encourage them to actually maintain these areas as reserves. And the need for that to happen is even more important today, as we can see developments chewing away around the edges. There's grasslands all throughout the north of Melbourne and the Northern Mary catchment, most of which are earmarked for destruction, some of which hopefully will be preserved. But yeah, these communities are becoming increasingly rare by the day. We need to do everything we can to try and encourage them to be properly protected in perpetuity. So yeah, unless there's any further questions, we might hand it back over to Dom and Charlotte if they're ready.
Everyone, I'm Charlotte, Ngarrk Management Committee. I'm here to talk about, so we were mentioning intertussic spaces and how important they are within grasslands. So a species that needs this is the golden sun moth. So technically it was thought to be endangered. So it's critically endangered nationally, extinct in Melbourne, but then in 2003 was found both here and in Galgi. midsummer, brown boring male comes flying only a couple of metres around in between the tussocks trying to find the female, as the gold sort of back leg wings that reflect through the sun. The male jumps around, it's got no mouthpiece, so it's struggling can't eat, so basically it's just trying to mate for the only few days that it'll be alive for. And then once it's done that, the lady will drop her eggs on the tussock, the bottom of the tussock. So these endangered species can only travel 100 to 200 metres. So once you get fragmentation of the grasslands, they can easily be wiped out. So that is something that's necessary in the management of grassland, is knowing what's there, because they are hard to see, surveying enough and having enough resources to know how to manage that, manage the area for the specific species.
One thing that Charlotte mentioned there is that the golden sun moth also doesn't have any mouth parts. So it does all the feeding in the larvae stage. That's in the base tussocks of wallaby grass, which is the grass that we've got here. But then we also find them feeding on the roots of the sour species. So this weed that myself and Soph talked about, the really intractable one, it also uses that for habitat. So we have a pretty annoying sort of situation here where there's a grass that we have to remove, but it's also the habitat for a critically endangered moth. So that's a really common thing in grasslands, is there's no simple answer. Really critically in our management practices of how we can. So we're a little bit further north of where we were before, presenting in a bit more of a lower spot in the landscape. So it's actually way higher quality. We have a lot more herbs here, such as chocolate lilies and tiny purple stars. Well, hopefully we'll find some in a sec. But here we want to illustrate the effect that development can have on hydrology. So hydrology referring to the water regimes or the way water flows under the ground. It's really important in grasslands, especially when you have huge factories that we're putting here. I believe in 2008, when about 40 hectares of the grassland was actually cleared. And so that really affected the way that water moves in through the grassland, both by just by rain and moving across. So we have way higher flow-off effects. So it rains on the hard surfaces, concrete roofs, etc., and then it runs off pretty fast rather than actually going into the grassland. Fortunately, here, a lot of the native sward of those wetter species of grasses, such as tussock grass, is still very intact. But one thing that can happen in a lot of grasslands, especially the urban ones that we find in reservoirs, such as Ngarrk or Bababi in Faulkner, they're starting to dry out on the effect, on the edge, which is what we call edge effect. So with those cooler grasses, including tussock grass, where it's wetter, we have the swelling and compacting of the soil. So we have the spring and winter rains, and then the summer really dries out that hard clay, and it kind of opens up these large fissures, which are oftentimes very deep. And that's where we see a lot of the species such as Microceras scipidra, also known as Marning or yam daisy. It was a really important indigenous bush food. We find it occurring in these areas. Unfortunately, the Marning, which is a really, really important food plant, very culturally significant, as I'm sure a lot of people know from Bruce Pascoe's work in Dark Emu, we don't actually find it in this grassland anymore. I believe the last time it was found was in the early 2000s. At another grassland a little bit further south of here called Galgi, we found 2 plots just waiting in between some tussocks. We've done a lot of work on trying to seed and propagate these species, reintroduce them to a lot of the grasslands, but we now need to really try and protect what remnant ones we have left. So we also find a lot of other species coming up here, a lot of important indigenous food plants. I'll try and find some just over here. So a lot of these
chocolate lily over here.
Yeah, we've got a chocolate lily here, also known as Arthropodium Strictum. Hopefully you can see that flower. It's really beautiful, really rich, vibrant purple flower. And it has a very, very large, about maybe half the size of a thumb, maybe a few centimeters long, a really carbohydrate-rich root, just like the Marning. And that was dug up and eaten. It can be eaten fresh. It can also be we see these coming up, just like I was mentioning a while ago, in the Intertussic Space. So we see this large sort of cleared area. There's a lot of weeds such as like plantain, silvery hairgrass, etc. coming up. But there's also a lot of the tropical lilies here, so they can be quite clandestine when they're not in flower. And these could all even be the same plant as the tuber has spread and come up. Yeah, so unless anybody has any questions, I think that's about it for this area. The main takeaway here is just that edge effect that development can have affecting the water regimes, the water flow, and also creating that edge effect where we get a lot of weeds coming in that might be brought in from cars or by trucks, and then they spread slowly into the grassland. All right, yeah, I might hand back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Tom and Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. So we're here now right in the middle of Galgi at a tributary of the Merri Creek, which is called Curly Sedge Creek. And we're at a spot which gives us a great example of how this creek gets its name. I'm surrounded here by an endangered species called curly sedge, Carex tasmanica. And as you can see, these little curly tips on the end of each leaf are what give this species its name. So Galgi and the sections of Curly Sedge Creek immediately to the north of it are the main stronghold of this endangered species around Melbourne. Yeah, it's only really known from the Merri catchment and the upper Merri catchment around Melbourne. There's a few populations down towards Portland, Budge Bim, that kind of area, and then some big populations in Tasmania as well. But as far as around Melbourne goes, the ones in Curly Sedge Creek are all there is. And yeah, there's many thousands of them growing here. Curly sedge is a really interesting plant because it has a very narrow set of conditions that it can live in. So you can sort of see this low creek valley, which is full of water at the moment, but most of the time is totally dry. We're in a very rare plant community here called grey clay drainage line aggregate, which is a beautiful name. Yeah, what that sort of refers to is it's a community you only find in these really low kind of rocky creeks that running through the middle of these basalt sort of soils where we get high salinity, relatively high salinity happening really close to the surface. You can see the Curly Sedge Creek here. It all seems to be in a band right along the edge of the creek here, and it doesn't really stray from this band at all. So even when the creek, the water dries away, or even in flood years, the sedge doesn't really move up the edges of the banks at all or into the middle. It's just in this narrow line where the conditions are perfect for it. Unfortunately, the conditions in this narrow line also favour some pretty nasty weeds. There's a great example just here. This is a very young spiny rush, Juncus acutus, which I think, I'm not going to pretend I know where it comes from. It's probably a South American species, but you can look that up. It doesn't really matter. It's yeah, it's here. It loves saline conditions as well. These are only tiny ones, but the plants themselves can grow up to you know, over a metre tall. They can really totally smother the landscape and yeah, pretty much eliminate the habitat for this curly sedge. We're fortunate because we have a project here at the moment to patrol the length of the creek, well, the length of the creek within Galgi Reserve at least, and try and knock out all of those spiny rushes. So the one here is probably not long for this world. But yeah, in other parts of the catchment, spiny rush is a really big issue for the survival of curly sedge. These saline, or relatively saline communities also support a bunch of other unique plants, or interesting plants anyway. I'm not sure how well this will show up on the camera, but we've got a tiny little one creeping through here with these little white flowers. This is a plant called creeping brookline, or Samolus creeping brookweed, or something like that anyway. Samolus repens. And yeah, again, it's something that really needs those saline conditions. So the main places you find it are actually in coastal salt marshes, but here along these slightly saline soils of these Merri tributaries, we find Samolus growing as well. And there's a host of other saline species that mostly are found in salt marshes that we do find in these little ephemeral Merri creeks, creeks around the Merri anyway. We've also got a great example behind us of an aquatic plant called water ribbons. So you can see them all poking up out of the creek here. They're all just fruiting at the moment. Yeah, water ribbons, or Cycnogeton, I think it's called now, Procerum. It's a fairly common plant throughout Victoria, but it's looking stunning at the moment. It loves these ephemeral sort of wetland kind of areas. It's actually got some really starchy tubers, which were an indigenous food plant as well. Yeah, and this is just a really beautiful cluster over here, enjoying these wet conditions. But yeah, it's quite unusual this year. If we were to come out here most other years at around the same time, this area would be bone dry, and the water ribbons would be making the most of its tubers to survive underground through those harsh conditions, waiting for the right moment we have now.
Thanks, Michael, for that. That's really interesting. It's really awesome to see Curly Sedge Creek. Not a lot of people know about it. It's really special, especially the that beautiful patch of triglockin, or the water ribbons there. So we're here at the last spot that we want to present of Bababi Marning, and we're here to really demonstrate the real threat that grasslands face. So grasslands, they're reduced to 1% of their original extent. So the natural temperate grasslands of the Victorian volcanic plain, it's a bit of a mouthful, as Michael mentioned, but they're really, really reduced in size, especially the ones in urban areas. So oftentimes people just think of them as open pastures or of just vacant lots, without actually knowing the real special flora and fauna that we find here, as we've shown you today. So in this grassland alone, we have 157 species of vascular flora found, and around 90 species recorded in 1997 of fauna. So we have amazing birds like raptors and falcons and eagles, but then we also have a huge mob of kangaroos that we actually had to walk through to get here, about 100 roos. And they occupy this really, really thin tract that goes down all the way from around Marnie's Road, all the way up north into the more open areas around, like, say, Kilmore or Wallen at the headwaters of the Merry. So a lot of these areas, although they've had spotty funding and spotty management practices over time, MCMC and especially the Friends of Merry Creek have been doing a huge amount of work, as we've mentioned. The reality is it's not enough, and we need far, far more work and money and volunteers and effort to actually go into maintaining these environments, especially as we have the huge threats from development, as we saw, and we can just see in the background here when factories are being built and grasslands are being destroyed. And then also, especially with the climate catastrophe, we have heavy changes to water regimes over years with boom and bust droughts. And then we also have extreme heat, which is both favouring other weeds to move in and really reducing the population and the genetic ability of a lot of native species to really proliferate and stay viable, especially into the future. So in this spot, we've chosen this spot to really kind of provide a picture of the real problem that we're facing with grasslands, especially with weed invasion, which is really the biggest threat, and is really what we spend most of our time dealing with on the ecological restoration team. So that plant that we mentioned earlier, Nacella trichotoma or serrated tussock, you can see it here moving through south down really into the creek. So this area, although there's a lot of serrated everywhere, it's still full of kangaroo grass. There's still a lot of speargrasses around, still a lot of lilies living in the understory. And it really is a slow tsunami, as Charlotte has mentioned, of serrated tussock. It moves slowly and it doesn't really pay attention, of course, as you can imagine, to the way we deal with things. It just flowers every year, spreads at a very, very rapid pace, and is very, very difficult to remove. So a lot of land managers, either state or private, really won't do anything about it, or they'll do very, very tokenistic sort of grant programs or funding programs for weed control. But it really, really needs more. And the reality of that is we can't do it alone. So we're only a team of around 11 people, and there's a lot of other Parks Victoria. They've had their funding drastically reduced by past governments, both left and right. And that really does go, that really is the same for a lot of other governments around Australia with their conservation and environmental programs. So what we're asking is for you to be equipped with this information, to tell your friends, to tell your family, to tell your workmates, to make them aware of this environment, which is the most critically endangered ecosystem in Australia. We see a lot of people, coming to arms over the Great Forest National Park, for example, or about mountain ash forests in the Yarra Ranges. And those often go out with a bang, they get chopped down. There's a lot of news headlines. But it's these areas out here that are really, there is a slow invasion and a slow destruction. And we've seen that recently with the Western Grassland Reserve out west past Werribee, which was a massive state initiative to offset a lot of these developments around Victoria where the grasslands were being cleared. And then they were buying up huge amounts of land out in the west to try and really create a beautiful grassland area. However, the reality was that I believe 5% of that was actually purchased by the government by the time that 100% was supposed to be purchased. And now the entire future of that grassland reserve, which was going to be one of the biggest grassland reserves probably in the world, the entire future of that is in question. And the reality is there's not enough political will, there's not enough community activism as it currently stands to actually try and make a difference. So what we're asking is for you to come out here, to experience the grasslands, to get involved in actually learning about the plants and learning about the threats and being able to tell people about that. And you don't even have to come out here really far in the north of Melbourne to find that. You can find grassland reserves in Reservoir at Ngarrk, as I mentioned, and along the Merri Creek, along the bike path at Bababi. I highly recommend go out there, get a feel for the grasslands, walk on this sacred country and find these plants, learn about them and how you can protect them. I think I'll leave it at that. I hope really that drives home that we've really shown to you today the difference that we can make when we come together and when we, especially in the form of community groups, and be on the lookout for any events up here, further down in your end of the creek, or any other environmental initiatives that will be happening. It's in our backyard and we actually can really make a difference out here. If there's any questions, I think I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Dom and Charlotte, Michael and Sophie for showing us around out there. Louisa, do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. I don't know how you knew that I was about to ask a question or look for the raise hand. So one thing I noticed, or I thought it would be good to clarify about that special form of the rosemary grevillea, because I noticed that Robert said it's the Latrobe grevillea. And I'd earlier popped in that it was rosemary grevillea, but the Merri Creek variety. I'm wondering if Michael or you or Dom or even Robert want to just make sure that we've got the right name for that.
Yeah, so Robert's absolutely correct. Latrobe grevillea is Latrobe's grevillea is the name that people have used for this sort of northern Melbourne variant. But as I was saying, it's still something that sort of hasn't been fully taxonomically clarified. So, yeah, sometimes people call it the Somerton form, which sort of ignores that there are plants along Plenty Gorge and Eltham as well. Yeah, sometimes it's called Grevillea latrobii, but again, the taxonomical questions haven't fully been answered, so some people still call it rosemary grevillea or Grevillea rosenmarinifolia, or all sorts of mouthful names. But yeah, Latrobe's grevillea is a name that is often used for this particular variety.
And Michael, could I ask another question? If someone was super keen to grow this special variety of of grevillea in their backyard somewhere in northern Melbourne. Is it available at Vinc, or is it so rare that it's not? You can't get it.
Look, it is available. They don't grow a huge amount of it. They mostly grow it when we request that they grow it. But yeah, it's worth talking to them because they may have leftover plants that are available. And yeah, Vinc obviously are a retail nursery. So yeah, I definitely recommend talking to Vinc and asking if they have the Somerton grevillea, I think they call it, or they might. Yeah, anyway, they'll know what you're talking about. So yeah, you could get some from Vinc. Probably some of the other nurseries around Melbourne. So the La Trobe Wildlife Sanctuary up at the Uni in Bundoora, they probably also propagate it as well. So yeah, definitely try your native nursery if you're interested in growing this at home.
Great. I'm just going to unmute Kai, who's got a question.
So this is another grevillea follow-up. As someone who is interested in them, there's a lot of what looks like rosemary grevillea growing along on reed edge spots along Edgar's Creek in like West Preston, Coburg North. Do you have a sense about whether that would be this local form or it's likely to be the kind of New South Wales one used there?
I suspect, but I could be wrong, that it will be the the cultivated variety. Yeah, it has been planted along the creek in places, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been planted widely, the local variety. So it's probable that the ones up along Edgar's Creek will be the more commonly available New South Wales Rosemary marinifolia. But yeah, I guess the main way you can tell is by whether they are root suckering or not. So I'm not recommending you go and start digging up the soil around the planted plants because that's probably not something we should be encouraging people to do. But it's mostly to do with the form of the plants. So yeah, I guess if you had samples of both and were able to view them side by side, that's the way you can guarantee you're identifying them. Yeah, it's trickier to tell without seeing them in person.
Not that I'm planning on digging them up, but which one is the one?
So the local one is the root suckering one. And if it's a really big kind of vibrant plant, so you can tell, I'm not sure how to sort of describe this in words, but yeah, the colour is a lot more sort of really bright on the flowers of the cultivated one. They're really vigorous. The leaves can be sort of kind of a limey green, whereas the indigenous one is sort of more of a grey green or a bluey green. Yeah, if it's a really big, healthy looking plant, it's probably not the local one.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Kai. And Louisa, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's fantastic to see Curly Sedge Creek with water in it. I haven't seen it all that many times, and I've certainly never seen it looking like that. Michael and Sophie, I thought I could hear some frogs in the background.
Yes, you can hear frogs in the background, and I might actually handball that one to you, Louisa, because I think your frog knowledge is a lot better than mine. Yeah, they're certainly. I've heard growling grass frog in Curly Sedge Creek before last summer, but they don't seem to be out at the moment.
No, today's probably not quite warm enough for them. No, tomorrow and Sunday are going to be getting better. I can't remember exactly. They certainly want it to be more than 20 degrees, I think, before they start calling. And yeah. I can't quite hear the other frogs now, but that's fine. I imagine you're probably hearing something like the common.
I think they're common froglets, yeah.
Froglets.
Yeah. But I always get common froglet and spotted marsh frog confused. I think these are common froglets.
Oh, the spotted marsh frogs make a more like a clock sort of noise.
Right. So I think these are common froglets. But I'm a botanist. This is outside my area of expertise.
just talking about what activities volunteers have helped with in the grasslands. Did we go over that a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess Galgi and Bababi Marning are really interesting because I wasn't listening when Charlotte and Don were talking about golden sun moth earlier on, but it was actually volunteers who discovered that species were still existing in these grasslands. So golden sun moth had been thought to be extinct from Melbourne for many decades until volunteers found them at Galgi in 2003, and subsequently, people started to find them when they searched for them at the right time, found them in a lot of other grasslands around Melbourne. But so volunteers have been heavily involved in doing surveys for golden sun moth here over the years. We don't have any surveys happening with volunteers this year, but it's something we can always try and get happening again if there's interest. But at Bababi Marning in particular, Friends of Mary Creek volunteers have done a huge amount of work for probably 15 years or more now to try and rid that grassland of gorse. They've slowly pushed the gorse back all the way along the length of the creek through Bababi Marning, and now they're starting to venture into the grassland itself. So yeah, volunteers have done a lot of woody weed control there. And I guess in some of the other grassland reserves, we've had volunteers involved in seed collection and sort of reintroduction programs to directly sow and reintroduce threatened species into those grasslands. Sarah, I don't know if you can think of any other activities, but those are the ones.
I was mostly thinking of the Friends of Mary Creek work. Yeah, getting rid of woody weeds is an excellent thing for volunteers to do because it is pretty hard work. And yeah, if we can get a big group out there doing that, it's great. And yeah, helping with mapping weeds and stuff. We've had a few TAFE groups out helping us to map the Chilean needle grasses and things, and the serrated tussocks and things, and that can really help us be really efficient in our weed control works. Oh, and weed orchid. Did you just talk about that?
I didn't mention the weed orchid, but no, so new sort of threats. Volunteers have been really important in helping us try and tackle new and emerging weeds as we discover them. So the South African orchid, Disa bracteata, is a emerging threat in grasslands and a lot of vegetation communities throughout Victoria. We found it at Ngarrk grassland in Reservoir about 8 years ago, and volunteers again were really crucial in helping us jump on board and try and stop that species in its tracks before it became established. And another thing that I think is worth mentioning that volunteers have been doing really well for over a decade. The Friends of Mary Creek run regular bird surveys 4 times a year, and Ngarrk is one of the, and Bababi Marning as well, are both locations that are on their both sites that they survey each quarter. Volunteers have been helping get really good data on the changing patterns in bird usage of these grasslands and in other places along the Mary as well.
And Michael, just a question from Yoko. She's asking about the method for surveying the golden sun moth.
So golden sun moth is a really particular species. It only emerges on, sort of from about December onwards. Sometimes it emerges a little bit earlier, but December's probably the most guaranteeable time. It emerges on really still, warm days where you're, in the mid-20s by 10 a.m. So sort of those 30-degree kind of days where there's very little cloud cover. And not much wind. The moths in good years will emerge in large numbers, and the way we survey them is by doing transects through the grassland. So sort of a structured kind of movement through the grassland on days when we've confirmed that they're flying at other locations. It just basically involves walking and looking and familiarising yourself with what they look like. And the surveys themselves are pretty easy.
Right, any more questions from anyone else?
Could you just quickly run through the pronunciation, especially of is it Ngarrk, the last word? My Woiwurrung's not all it could be, and also the two listed in the chat.
In the chat, yep.
Yeah, the pronunciation meaning, please.
Yes, hang on, let me go. So, I'll have to test my knowledge. So Bababi Marning is mother's foot, I'm pretty sure. Is that right, Michael?
Bababi
Jinanang. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bababi Jinanang is mother's foot, and Ngarrk
Thigh bone.
thigh bone.
But yeah, the NG is kind of a ny noise, so nyari and Ngarrk.
What's with the anatomical designations?
So these were names suggested by a Wurundjeri elder, Auntie Dora and Garby. So about 13 or 14 years ago, Friends of Merry Creek sort of approached Wurundjeri and asked whether they would suggest names for these grasslands. So I guess the body picture is sort of viewing Marran Baba, which is the collective name for these grasslands, as the mother. So Marran Baba literally means the body of the mother. And then each of the grasslands are different components making up that whole.
Great. Any last questions before we wrap up? And you guys can always get in contact with anyone at MCMC as well. If you think of something afterwards, you can feel free to send us an email or something through the Facebook page. And we're happy to answer those.
And is it worth spruiking? Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
Oh, yeah, just spruiking. There's another grassland tour in a week or a couple of weeks' time, the Ngarrk tour.
Yeah, that's right. Next weekend, at the same time as this one, the Ngarrk tour is happening. And I guess, to answer, I'm just seeing some questions from Kate in the chat about orchids. Ngarrk does have populations of sun orchids and onion orchids. The onion orchids might be flowering now. They'll be very tricky to spot because they're pretty small green things, so they get lost amongst all the other green things. The sun orchids, if you're lucky, may be flowering now, but it also might be just a little bit too late. They might have closed up. But so if you tune into next week's webinar, you might be able to see sun orchids. So Dom and Sophie are going to be hosting that and exploring Ngarrk and Reservoir. But if you wanted to explore it yourself, you may find sun orchids in flower at the moment.
Yeah, it's a particularly good year for wildflowers and things with all the rain and the nice warm days we've had. Everything's going pretty wild. It's a really nice time to be out. And very grateful that we're allowed out and about now, which is good. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for being patient with the wind and joining us on one of the first weekends of the freedoms that we have at the moment. It was really nice being able to show you guys these grasslands, and thanks to Michael, Sophie, Dom, and Charlotte for getting out there today. And as I mentioned, if you have any more questions that you think of and want to get answered, you can ask through the Facebook page or one of our emails. I can probably pop up one of our emails in the chat. And thank you very much, everyone.